Hi, David.
Hello, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm good.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio. Podcaster David Sloan Wilson of Binghamton University. You're an evolutionary biologist. You've written a number of books, including, most recently, Does Altruism Exist? Could you hold that book up for us, David, without seeming to be self-promotional? I mean, after all, I'm requesting it, and you're reluctantly... I see the reluctance in your eyes, but you're willing to do it. Thank you.
I am. Thank you. There it is.
Does altruism exist? And that's what we're going to talk about today, largely, at least, is altruism. Under what circumstances can we expect altruism to evolve? And correspondingly, what kind of natural inclinations toward altruism are there in human beings? In what senses is it, quote, natural to be altruistic? So this is ultimately a conversation about human nature. Now, let me start off by giving a little background. You are, as is known to kind of insiders, people in evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology, you have long been part of a debate with, among other people, this person. I'm holding up the book, The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins.
There you go.
Very influential book that was published in 1974. You take issue with his account of how we should think about the evolution of altruism. So let me quickly characterize that. His account is often called individual selectionist. Yours is often popularly called group selectionist. I think you prefer the term multi-level selection for the process you're describing. But in any event, if people want to Google the debate, probably individual selection and group selection is a good way to get to it. So Dawkins, in this book, it's a very avowedly anti-group selection book. He early on in the book says, there are some biologists who kind of naively assume that evolution works for, quote, the good of the group or even the good of the whole species. So, for example, if they see that in times of scarcity, when there's a drought, that in some species animals forego reproduction for a while, these biologists might naively assume it's for the good of the group, because the idea is that you won't put a stress on the food supply for the whole population, so you're kind of altruistically foregoing reproduction for the good of the group. Dawkins would say in that kind of case, it's more likely that it's just that the survival prospects for your own offspring have diminished, and that's why you're foregoing reproduction. Again, not that the organism is consciously thinking about this, but this is the logic of natural selection. Now, Dawkins did say there are two cases where we can expect altruism to evolve. One is called kin selection, refers to altruism among family members, and this is not his idea. It's an idea associated with William Hamilton, among others. But he said this kin selection can happen because when you look at it, given the fact that you share a lot of genes with close family members, most notably the genes conducive to this particular kind of focused altruism, it makes sense that we would all be inclined we're more inclined to jump in the lake to save a sister or brother than somebody we don't know. The second kind of altruism he emphasizes as plausible, which is often associated with Robert Trivers, perhaps George Williams deserves a nod as well, is so-called reciprocal altruism. This is what we see in, for example, friendship, where, I have a stable relationship with someone, I do favors for them, they do favors for me. Again, it's not that we're necessarily thinking about the reciprocation, but what Dawkins and Trivers would say is, if you look at the feelings that undergird friendship, my feeling of warmth toward the person, obligation toward them, guilt if I betray them, and so on, those feelings were built into us by natural selection because it's good for my genes, and he says, so to think about that happening, you don't have to think about the good of the group. That he says that's not a form of group selection. Now you say that, so those are two kinds of altruism, and I would say that broadly speaking, evolutionary psychology to a large extent has followed Dawkins in this emphasis. You say that's certainly not a complete account. I do want to get clear at the outset before I turn this over to you, and so you can tell us what you do think. It's not that you're saying that these two kinds of altruism can't evolve or don't evolve. It's not like you're saying that what he describes as kin selection couldn't happen, or what he describes as reciprocal altruism couldn't happen. That dynamic seems plausible to you, but your critique is a larger one, right?
Yeah, so one point to make is that plus more would be my view. But another one is that is actually not an alternative to group selection, because one of the things that Dawkins said, following everyone else at the time, was that this idea of group selection, although possible in principle, almost never happened. And then gene selection, inclusive fitness theory, reciprocity were all advanced as models for the evolution of altruism that do not invoke group selection. So the idea that they were explaining altruism another way, often in a way that made it seem like a form of self-interest. For example, I'm being altruistic to my brother, but I'm also maximizing my inclusive fitness.
Right.
And when I scratch your back, I'm don't need to be thinking about you because I'm confident that you'll scratch mine. And so one of the things about all of these other frameworks, selfish gene theory, inclusive fitness theory, reciprocity theory, is that they really explain altruism as a form of self-interest. Whereas with group selection, it seems to explain altruism in a way that's more at face value, that if you have an altruist who is just always helping others at their own expense and accepts that cost, nevertheless, that can evolve by a Darwinian process, makes it seem as if you're explaining altruism at face value. And so these are some of that's just basically fleshing out your own very able description.
Okay. So, and picking up on something you said, I think there's another thing you don't disagree with Dawkins on, in addition to the fact that those two kinds of altruism can indeed evolve. And or maybe I'm wrong here, but in a certain sense, you're not taking issue with the, quote, selfish gene hypothesis. I mean, as you suggested, what Dawkins would say is, well, when you're being kind to kin or sacrificing for them, at the level of the gene, that's not a sacrifice, because the whole evolutionary logic behind it is that the gene responsible for the sacrifice has a good chance of being in those kin, and as you in the long run, this altruism, the gene is helping itself. Again, the gene isn't thinking about it. He didn't mean that by the title of selfish gene, but the gene is helping itself. Now, I think you don't disagree with Dawkins that in general, what we expect in evolution is that those genes that do a good job of getting themselves into other, into future generations will do better than those genes that don't. In that sense, even with what is called group selection, multi-level selection, this baseline fact remains true, right? In your view, that those genes most conducive to their own replication are the ones that come to dominate the gene pool.
Well, at some point, we're going to talk about culture. And then with culture, of course, units are evolving, which are not genes. Sure. So there's a whole piece having to do with culture.
Sure.
When we restrict ourselves to genetic evolution, then it's true that anything that evolves is more fit than what didn't evolve, all things considered. And so that rendition of selfish genes is perfectly fine. It can't be otherwise. So the interesting question is, what does it exclude? And what's wrong about Dawkins, and this is not just me talking, is the idea that this idea of gene selfishness somehow excludes a group selection, whereas group selection properly understood, that altruistic gene is indeed selectively disadvantageous within groups. Selfishness does beat altruism within groups, but with a multi-group population structure, it can still be the case that altruistic groups beat selfish groups, and then all things considered, the altruistic gene is most fit. So all of that fits within selfish gene theory. Group selection fits within selfish gene theory, but the only thing that made selfish gene theory newsworthy, along with inclusive fitness and reciprocity, was that this was something that did not invoke group selection. So it's the two-theory mentality, the idea that we have two theories in which one can be right and the other can be wrong. This is what was a great mistake, basically, back then when the selfish gene theory the selfish gene was published. And what we've learned since then is that all theories of social evolution basically use the same logic, and that is the logic of multi-level selection. Let me just spin that out, because there's three principles that I think are especially easy to understand and especially important when we get to cultural evolution. So you don't need to be an evolutionist to understand this. You just need to be a human being, okay? So may I give my three principles?
Yes, most of our audience is human beings, so proceed. So this should work if you're right.
Yeah, it's a theory that applies to non-human beings too, although they don't understand it.
Right.
Okay. Number one, everyone needs to know that natural selection is based on relative fitness, not how well you survive or reproduce in absolute terms, always in comparison to alternative types. There's something relentlessly comparison about natural selection. Number two, if you imagine those traits that we associate with morality, altruism, and behaving for the good of the group, they typically involve people helping each other, providing services for each other at their own expense. And the alternative of these traits, what we call selfish traits, or freeloading traits, or exploitative traits, typically involve the individual helping themselves at the expense of others within their own groups. And so this idea of selfishness is something that's good for you, bad for the group. And altruism is something that's good for the group at your own expense, of course, is deeply embedded in what we think about human morality. And when we think about it in evolutionary terms, we can say is that typically the traits that we associate with morality and for the good of the group are not selectively advantageous within the group. In other words, they do not deliver the highest relative fitness within the group. And this, for Darwin, posed an incredible problem, because how can you explain morality as a product of a Darwinian process? This was what Darwin faced.
And we should emphasize that this is a point that Dawkins himself emphasizes. Within the group, in the day-to-day competition among genes within a group, so-called selfishness prevails, and then he says, and that fact is going to override any selective pressure at the so-called group level. And the other thing we should say is that people like Dawkins, certainly George Williams, who Dawkins acknowledges as an important influence on him, in George Williams' 1968 book, Adaptation and Natural Selection, he says group selection can happen. It's just that the circumstances under which it can happen, in Williams's view, were pretty restricted, and he thought did not apply very often in the course of human evolution.
Totally. Yep, you're absolutely right. So what I'm reporting total consensus, and just read, it starts on page 6 of at least the first edition of Dawkins' book, in which he goes through this logic himself. So we're all on the same page here. So now the question is, if altruism can't evolve on the basis of the evolutionary forces taking place within a single group, how can it evolve? And the third step of multi-level selection theory is that it evolves by a process selection at the group level. If there's multiple groups, if they vary, then the altruistic groups will robustly outcompete the non-altruistic groups. And so that leads to the slogan that Ed Wilson and I coined at the end of a 2007 paper: selfishness beats altruism within groups, altruistic groups beat selfish groups, everything else is commentary. Now Dawkins, following everyone else at that time, agreed with all of this except for one thing. They made an empirical claim. They said, the fact of the matter is, even though group selection could work, only very seldom is between group selection strong enough to trump within group selection. And Dawkins asked rhetorically, imagine that selfish mutation getting into that group and doing so much better than the altruist. What's to prevent the selfish gene from taking over the altruist, that group, converting it into a selfish group? And the implication was that the process of between group selection could not possibly be strong enough to impose this process. And when we fast forward to the present, what we've learned is au contraire. If you look at many models and many empirical studies, we know that higher level selection is often strong enough to trump lower level selection. And so this logic that everyone agrees upon actually is the logic behind all evolutionary theories of social behavior. And the fact that those other theories, kin selection, selfish gene theory, reciprocity, seem to indicate otherwise turns out to be a matter of perspective in terms of how the comparisons were being made. And so this has led to a concept called equivalence. It's almost as if these theories are like different languages. Mm-hmm. And in order for us to understand each other, we have to be multilingual. I speak English, you speak French. We just have to be bilingual in order to understand each other. And if you're not, then you're part of the problem. Then you're saying, don't speak French, that's wrong, you've got to speak English. And although most people have made that transition, in fact, by far the majority of people publishing in the peer-reviewed literature, there's a few people that have not made that transition, and unfortunately, they're very prominent. They include Richard Dawkins, Ed Wilson on the other side, Steve Pinker, Jerry Coyne are still fighting an old battle, a very old battle, and it is embarrassing for them.
Well, we'll get to that. I do want to empathize if your plight is that all the people you failed to enlighten are prominent. That is an unfortunate predicament. But keep at it. Let me say a couple of things. So one thing you're saying is that kin selection and reciprocal altruism should be considered analytically a form of group selection, technically. So there, as you said, it's a linguistic thing. I could say, in that sense, I don't mean this too dismissively, but that part of it is a semantic dispute. And when I say I don't mean it too dismissively, I mean the relabeling of those things doesn't change what traits we expect those dynamics to produce, right? So that doesn't change what we would expect to evolve via kin selection. Once you consider it a form of group selection, if you do, and some people do, that doesn't change the nature of, say, familial love that you expect, or familial guilt, or anything else to evolve from it. So it's important to emphasize you're saying more than that. You're saying, in addition to the idea that kin selection and reciprocal altruism are forms of group selection, because they're, I think the consequences of that are in the sense that I just said, in a way limited, in a way not maybe. But you're saying more than that. You're also saying that things that Dawkins himself would call group selection actually do happen and result in forms of altruism and altruistic tendencies that Dawkins and Pinker and others do not acknowledge, right?
Yeah, that's true. Let me go back to the semantic issue and then quickly get to your point, which I think is the most interesting point for most people. What forms of altruism are out there that are not easily understood in terms of nepotism and reciprocity? But to return to that semantic point, I think the fact that the idea that this idea of group selection was rejected and the fact that we have to change our mind on that is very important, because after all, group selection is the theory that explains altruism at face value. If you ask the question, does altruism evolve, and then you define an altruistic trait in the straightforward way that everyone does, and then you show, yes, it can evolve despite the fact that it's self-sacrificial, this is very important to be able to say that altruism can evolve at face value. And then another point, which is actually we'll be getting to again, is that there's two key concepts involved with the group selection controversy. One is altruism, but the other is the concept of organism, the idea that a society or a group, even quite a sizable group, can somehow qualify as an organism in the same way that we do. And of course, this is a very, very old metaphor in politics and in philosophy and so on. And we could fast forward to where we're going to get to when we start talking about economics. And the idea that a modern human society, small or large, actually is a kind of an organism, that is full of implications for how we construct those societies. So if there's a scientific case for saying that the concept of organism is multi-level, that in a multi-tier hierarchy, everything from genes to individuals to groups of all scales, that any one of those levels can acquire the properties of an organism, that is very new and radical and not something that you really get to very easily when you think of nepotism in some small scale or reciprocity in some small scale. How can that help you explain how a nation, for example, could qualify as an organism, or even a fish school?
Well, I think what so-called individual selectionists would say is that's largely, and we'll come to this, I don't want to get there quite yet, but that's largely about cultural evolution, which is a different process and different kettle of fish. And they'd say what binds a nation together is certainly not, nationalistic genes per se, but it has to do with cultural evolution. That's what they'd say. So we're going to get there. Let me pause on one point, just to illustrate for people the kinds of issues that come up when you're deciding whether group selection is plausible or not. I think I remember from George Williams's book an example he gave where group selection was plausible, and I think it was like parasites on some animal, and it was like a chicken. So there's a group of parasites, think of that as a group, and he said whether whether they are going to restrain their voraciousness in eating the chicken and be altruistic in that sense, so that they don't kill the chicken, which would be bad for the whole group. I think he said that depends partly on how often they're jumping to other chickens. So like if the rate of migration from one chicken to another is high enough, then they can, so to speak, afford to kill the chicken. And so things like migration rate from one group to another come into play. And that's a very clear-cut example, but you can imagine when you're talking about human populations, migration rate's a little less clear, perhaps, and a slightly, in reality, a slightly more amorphous thing. I'm just mentioning that as in case people are wondering, like, well, what do people argue about when they argue whether group selection is plausible? It depends on things like migration rate, right?
Well, yeah, and I guess please don't portray me to our audience as the Lone Ranger, the only supporter of group selection. What we see over the decades is case after case of group selection being established. So the one that you mentioned is the evolution of avirulence in diseases, and there the selfish trait is a disease strain, which is basically consuming as much of the host as possible, and then the altruistic trait. Disease is the one that's more prudent, basically, keeps its host alive, and so the whole group can propagate itself better. That's actually a classic case of group selection.
Which Williams acknowledges, I think Dawkins would acknowledge. What they're saying is that Williams certainly did. Williams brought it up as an example of group selection happening.
He did, Bob, but in 1987, this is the progress that I'm trying to tell you about. He was not saying this in 1966 when he wrote his book, nor was Dawkins in 1976.
I think he was. I think it's in his book, David. But we can say that's an empirical question. Sorry.
We can, and so what we find is, and you're right, it is a matter of these parameters. When you actually do the math, or you do careful studies, it is very much depends on what we call the population structure, how much migration there is between groups, and all of this sort of thing. But what both the models and the empirical studies have shown is that there a large region of the parameter space in this population structure is one in which between group selection is a significant evolutionary force. And so this idea that within group selection always trumps between group selection, it just ain't so. And it's very important for this to become the consensus view, as it is among the people who are publishing, most of the people who are publishing in the peer-reviewed literature.
Okay. Now, my next question is, so my view had been, the way I've depicted this, in keeping with kind of what you agree has been kind of a mainstream view within evolutionary psychology, not necessarily within population biology, evolutionary biology, but my tendency has been, in writing about this, been to say, okay, group selection can happen. The consensus among evolutionary psychologists, or certainly when I was writing this, it was a consensus, is that in human evolution, the circumstances required for group selection to happen have not very often prevailed, so it's not a major force in human evolution. You think that consensus is wrong. It's been a bigger force in human evolution. So let me ask, where do we see that? I mean, the reason I remain kind of unpersuaded of your worldview is I haven't really delved into the technical details of your kind of mathematical arguments and so on. It's just that when I look around, I see the kind of altruism that seems to me the kind predicted by reciprocal altruism. That doesn't mean it's always like dyadic, just two people. But, there are people clearly are good at handling like groups and thinking of themselves as part of a group. But what I don't see is a certain kind of altruism I might expect to result from group selection, which is what you might call a kind of diffuse or uncritical form of altruism. In other words, what I see is people monitoring the contributions of others very carefully, if subconsciously, and refraining from bestowing altruism on people that they don't think are paying their share. So in other words, we seem designed to punish freeloaders, so to speak. So my question is that, are you saying, no, there's purer forms of altruism that have developed? Or are you saying, yeah, I'm right, but I should think of that as a product of group selection?
Well, first I want in this conversation, I want to make sure that we're using the right frame of comparison, which is relative fitness within groups, okay? Mm-hmm. So that's what we're going to be talking about evolution, therefore alternative types of individuals, and we're going to compare their fitness. But I want to make sure that we compare their fitness within a single social group. Now, against that background, I'm pretty sure that you've heard of the concept of altruistic punishment, have you?
If you mean punishing freeloaders and people who don't reciprocate and so on. Well, I guess I haven't heard the exact term. I would assume that's what it means.
Yeah, so basically, first let's imagine the classic altruistic trait of the sort that you would certainly agree is altruistic. I extend myself towards others, you don't, okay? Mm-hmm. Now let's imagine a policing behavior, which is basically, I'm a cooperator, but if I see a selfish act, then I punish that selfish individual.
Okay.
Now
Now I know what you mean. Go ahead and explain it. Yeah.
Now you have to contrast that with the alternative trait, which is a non-punisher. Mm-hmm. So what you have is you have a 2x2 box, two traits, two alleles within each trait. You have altruistic versus selfish in the primary trait, and then you have the punisher and the non-punisher for the punishing trait. And the key here is that in many kinds of social interactions, punishment is itself a form of altruism, because the punisher has a lower fitness than the non-punisher within the same group. So what you've done is you've not solved the problem. It's true that in a group full of punishers, then being selfish is no longer an option because you just get slammed for it. So you've solved that problem. But you've solved it only by substituting the exact same problem at the level of the punisher versus the non-punisher. So the problem of altruism remains. And it's absolutely true that when you look at most human social organizations, and many animal social organizations as well, you see lots of punishment. But the existence of punishment is no argument against multi-level selection when you use the right frame of comparison of relative fitness within single groups.
Okay, so I guess the way I had tended to think of that is that, first of all, within straightforward reciprocal altruism to people, the theory does predict punishment in the sense that if I do a favor for this person and the person either doesn't reciprocate in the future or does out and out bad things to me, I either withhold future altruism or out and out do something nasty to the person that may have some cost to me. And in that sense, it's kind of altruistic punishment. But it's more altruistic when I'm part of a group of three people and A does something bad to B, and then I punish A, right? Because then A hasn't done anything to me, but in a sense, he didn't uphold the rules of the obligations of the group, and I punish the person in a way that's, so to speak, good for the cohesion of the group. In any event, it's kind of on behalf of the person who was wronged. Now, I guess I had thought in my own head, well, I can imagine that. In fact, I know I described this in a book of mine, and you seized on it. I said, imagine a club-forming gene. And of course, there isn't such a thing, but theoretically. So first, you'd expect reciprocal altruism to evolve first. Maybe it's more straightforward. And you can imagine how then, once you've got reciprocal altruism, then groups of three, adaptation supporting groups of three, mutually altruistic groups of three, internally altruistic groups of three could evolve. And I think it could include the kind of monitoring and altruistic punishment you're describing. That's the way I had thought of it. But of course, you would say, for starters, yeah, I should consider that a form of group selection, right? If within the population, one thing that's happening is this group of three is out, competing other groups of three that are not so cohesive. I should think of that as group selection, even if it's within a single, like, hunter-gatherer band or something, right?
That's right. And this shows you some subtle differences, why it's important to be multilingual and to be able to handle multiple frames of comparison. When you're using the multi-level frame of comparison, relative fitness within groups, consider the following trait. I'm in a group. I do something that benefits all of us, me plus everyone else, and it costs me nothing. This is a no-cost public good, and it's unrealistic because most public goods do cost something. We'll pretend that this doesn't. So I do something that benefits all of us, including me, no cost to myself, and I ask you, where are the fitness differences in that scenario? There's no fitness differences. There's nothing for natural selection to operate on. Now let's just imagine that there's another group out there that doesn't include me. And so now my group is doing better than that group, thanks to my single effort. Now we have a fitness difference to work with. But you need to have more than one group in order to tell that story. And so now psychologically, you could well imagine that me, the one that I might have only my interest in mind. Psychologically, I would qualify as a selfish individual. I don't care about the people in my group. I just care about me. The fact that they're coming along for the ride means nothing to me. So the whole calculus of a selfish individual, by which we mean an individual that cares only about their absolute welfare, is a different frame of comparison than the calculus of relative fitness within and between groups. And as long as we become multilingual, we can just basically shuttle back and forth between these frames of comparison. We can see when we operate in multi-level selection mode that many traits which would be considered as selfish based on other frames of comparison, based on relative fitness within and between groups, absolutely require group selection.
Okay, now let me ask you the question I had said I had kind of imagined that a certain kind of group selection, perhaps analogous to the kind we described with the parasites on the chicken, could in principle lead to a very diffusely altruistic tendency. Like, I just go around doing nice things to people I see on the street without regard for whether they might ever help me out. Now, I don't see most people behaving like that. Do you think I'm wrong in that? And there really are even these kind of more extreme, diffuse, you might say uncritical forms of altruism that are a product of a particular kind of group selection? Or is that just not a claim you're making? I guess in a way I'm asking, are you painting a significantly sunnier picture of human nature than the evolutionary psychologists like John Tooby, Steve Pinker, Martin Daly, with whom you disagree?
Yes, I am, although I'm not sure how much they would disagree. But here, I think this is a nice way to segue directly to everyday life. So here's some work that I've actually done. It's not hard to measure how nice people are, how pro-social they are. Not only can you give them surveys, but you could actually validate those surveys by looking at their actual behavior. And what you find is something that I think accords through all of our experience. Once you take away our theoretical lenses of various sorts, just consult your own life, basically. And please, everyone who's listening to us, consult your own life. I think what you'll find is that there's all kinds of people out there, just total sweeties. They're exactly the way that you described. Their policy is just
I want you
nice.
to introduce me to them, David.
I will. You might be one yourself.
I want to move them from your life to mine.
Well, I have studied this at a citywide scale. So I've studied this in thousands of people. And I've validated it with real-world behaviors. For example, and you're familiar with some of these, Bob, but that famous method called the lost letter method, where you drop stamped self-addressed envelopes on sidewalks, and then you see who's kind enough to pick it up and drop it into a post office.
Yeah, I would say that's a pretty limited expenditure, a pretty limited sacrifice, but okay.
Yeah, but all these experimental, all of this huge literature on experimental games, which are basically microcosms in which some people are cooperative and other people aren't. Yeah. These are played all around the world, including for stakes that amount to several months' income in some poor countries where these games are played. And so the result is that in social goods games of all kinds. You can do it in the laboratory, you can do it in everyday life, okay?
Right.
What you find is, in the first place, a lot of variation. And the typical result is, talk to people like Herb Gintis and Sam Bowles, they'll say, in these experiments, about 15% of the players play the way economists think that all people should behave, are supposed to behave. In other words, they're out for themselves, they figure out the game, and then they just try to maximize their monetary payoff. Now, the rest of the 85% are actually more generous than the economists think that all of human nature should be. Now, back to my own work in the city of Binghamton. So we have this bell-shaped curve, basically. Prosociality, as you might expect, is a bell-shaped curve. Most people are in the middle. Most people act like, a few people act like Homo economicus, and a few people act like Mother Teresa is reputed to have acted, although I'm aware that Mother Teresa is not what she appeared to
allegedly
to be. Now here's the next thing that we did. We also were able to measure the social and how supportive the social environment was for these people. So not only did we know how pro-social you are as an individual, but how pro-social is your social environment. And by that we measured family, neighborhood, school, church, extracurricular activities. So you're giving, if you're a high pro, you're giving. What are you getting? And if you're a low pro, you're not giving. What are you getting? In other words, what's the correlation between you as an individual and your social environment? And that, by the way, is the proper interpretation of the term R in inclusive fitness theory. It's the correlation between an individual and the individual social environment. Now, what we showed was that the correlation was very high. It was 0.7. And so what that meant was that most of the highly pro-social individuals got in addition to giving. They were giving, but they were also receiving because they were surrounded by a nurturing social environment.
So they were in an environment where there was kind of an implicit agreement that, hey, we go around helping each other and we all benefit.
Well, again, who knows what they were thinking? That's
no, I don't mean they were thinking that. I said implicit. There was, in other words, and I even, I think I sketched out a scenario like this maybe in my book, The Moral Animal, imagining it to be an adaptation that could have happened through so-called individual selection, where you would, where individuals actually be responsive to the kind of social environment they were in. So through upbringing, they would get a sense for like what their environment is like, and if it's an environment where you're nice to people and it ultimately pays off, sure. But I guess one thing I'd say is, okay, so what you're describing is not the real diffuse, uncritical form of altruism, where it wouldn't matter how pro-social your environment is, right? You just go around doing nice things. I mean, that would be what I would say an extreme group selectionist scenario, right? And that's not what you're describing.
No, I mean, I think it's false to call that an extreme group selectionist scenario. For one thing,
but it's not what you're describing, right?
Well, in a way, it is. I think you could take an unguarded altruist, okay, and put them into many modern social environments, and actually they'll do fairly well. They're not protecting themselves, but other parts of the system are protecting them, okay. And of course, it's a systemic thing how well you're going to. But I agree with you that completely unguarded altruism is difficult to evolve. That's no argument against group selection. That's because when you look at all the guarded forms of altruism, you come to situations that require altruistic punishment, basically, and somebody's got to be creating the system and maintaining the system. At the end of the day, this idea that which it takes for the group to work well does not give you the highest relative fitness within the group. That's a very robust conclusion. The end products that you get out of it are very highly structured. They're very guarded. Most social worlds bristle with protections against selfishness, but those mechanisms themselves are something which had to evolve by group selection. They did not evolve on the basis of relative fitness within groups.
Okay, so we've got a couple things you've described. One is so-called altruistic punishment. And I think there is some evidence from behavioral economics that this is somewhat prevalent, that in other words, people will, when they put them in these situations where they have money and they have to sacrifice actual money, and there's somebody who's like not playing nice, people will sacrifice a little money to punish that person in a way that seems to be not strictly speaking in self-interest, but is good for the larger group. There's some of that. And then there's this thing you described where people have pro-social tendencies, which are particularly pronounced if they find themselves in a pro-social environment. I'm wondering, when you described, I can imagine that if you described those to the so-called individual selectionists we've described in evolutionary psychology, they would say, sure, I acknowledge that these tendencies are a product of natural selection, and what you're describing as the dynamic that led to them, I would call individual selection, or maybe I have some alternative individual selectionist explanation. In other words, is there agreement at the level of like what the adaptation has been in human evolution, and they're saying it's still not what I would call group selection, or do they?
No, I don't think so. I think so. Again, this is where I think that that a few prominent people notwithstanding, if you look especially for cultural evolution, then cultural multi-level selection is the prevailing theory. Look at all of the leaders studying cultural evolution. Yeah. They speak straightforwardly in terms of cultural multi-level selection. And moreover, this idea of equivalence, that every statement in one theory can be translated into the other theory, is not quite correct. It's correct for certain simple core models, additive models. But by the time you get to examples of cultural evolution at a large scale, including at the national scale, then there's no way that you can take some of these very plausible scenarios for the cultural evolution of large-scale human society and think of that either in terms of inclusive fitness theory or in terms of reciprocity in any narrow sense at all. The scale is just way too large. Why is it, for example, that some nations are more inclusive than other nations? If you look at books such as Why Nations Fail or The Spirit Level or Peter Turchin's book on the Rise and Fall of Empires, you know, what is it that makes a society at that scale more cooperative than another? Trying to boil that down to inclusive fitness theory or reciprocity, forget about it.
Yeah, well, nobody would, though. Evolutionary psychologists wouldn't. I mean, they would agree with you that those differences are cultural. Those are, here we are talking about the evolution of culture, the evolution of laws, of norms, of religions, and so on.
You're using the word culture as if it's a different universe.
Well, it's a somewhat different process. I mean, Dawkins himself, in the final chapter of The Selfish Gene, as you know, emphasizes that there is this thing called cultural evolution that is in some ways very parallel to genetic evolution. In fact, some evolutionary psychologists think he overstated it. But nobody's denying that I personally am inclined to emphasize the parallels with genetic evolution. But even I acknowledge cultural evolution is a much analytically messier thing than genetic evolution. But in any event, if what you're saying, if you're saying that some of this pro-sociality is a result of cultural programming, religious exhortation, whatever, then we're in a totally different kettle of fish. And I think most of these evolutionary psychologists, so-called individual selectionists, would say, well, that's not. I'm not contesting that. They say I'm not even arguing about individual versus group selection in the realm of cultural evolution. I'm just talking about genetically based adaptations.
Again, so I think that that is there's much more coherence to be had there, and let's just spend a few more minutes on it. Cultural evolution is like genetic evolution in the following respect: a meme, a cultural trait,
a term Dawkins coined to his credit, you might say.
Happy to use the word meme. Can evolve in a number of ways. It can evolve at the expense of any human, like a disease. It can evolve by causing individual humans to do well at the expense of other humans within their group. Or it can evolve by causing a whole human group to do well compared to other groups. In other words, the same determination of finding out, of comparing fitness within and between groups is something that you have to do for a cultural trait in the same way that you have to do it for a genetic trait. And so when we say that cultures evolve, it can evolve at any of those levels, basically. But when we say that a cultural trait evolves by benefiting a whole group compared to another group, we're making the equivalent claim, group selection claim, for a cultural trait as we would for a genetic trait. It's the same logic, and it's the same set of operations. So the idea that says, oh, you can say whatever you like about culture, let's get back to genes.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. I'm saying when you start talking about culture, there is no disagreement between you and these people, because they're not talking about culture. They're not denying it exists. It's just that their arguments against group selection are confined to the realm of genes. They haven't taken issue with culture. Most of I don't know ones that have taken issue.
No. I mean, it's again, how can you say that? For example, let's say that you're an evolutionary psychologist, right? And you're studying people, and you say what you're going to say about people. Are you telling me that that's all genetic? If you're studying people, then you're studying a product of both genes and
environment.
Culture.
Yes, of course. Of course. But if for example, I did show them very diffuse altruism. And I said, it's through cultural evolution, and there's this religion that's really convinced people to be nice to everyone. It's this diffuse altruism that you said wouldn't evolve. They would say, well, I didn't say it couldn't evolve through cultural evolution. I would say it couldn't evolve through merely genetic evolution. So that's
okay. So one argument is, and this is an argument that some people take, is that the received wisdom for genetic multi-level selection is correct, but with cultural evolution, then group selection can be a lot stronger for human cultural evolution than it is for genetic evolution. That's a perfectly coherent position. Happens to be wrong, but it's a perfectly coherent position.
I think that's the common position. And I think whether it's wrong is an empirical question ultimately, I think.
Well, it is, but that's why I keep pulling you and other people back to the fact is read the peer-reviewed literature, for God's sake. Dawkins hasn't written a peer-reviewed article forever. Pinker's never written a peer-reviewed article on group selection. So neither is Jerry Coyne. So these guys are just playing the oldies back from the 1960s and 70s. Read people like David Queller, who's someone who likes, prefers inclusive fitness. Even Stuart West. These are the people that are.
Okay, but what would they say? What would they say?
The first thing they would talk about is equivalence, okay? What I've been talking about as equivalence. Group selection isn't wrong. It's a certain accounting method.
Okay. But I really think that to the extent that you're invoking cultural evolution to explain forms of altruism, I think you're really never arguing with people like John Tooby and Steve Pinker. I really don't, because I don't think any of them deny that cultural evolution happens in math. I mean, Steve Pinker wrote this huge book on how norms have evolved in a positive direction over time so that people are behaving more gently toward one another and so on. That's about cultural evolution.
Yeah, so there's a nice place where everybody can go to kind of see this controversy being playing itself out. And that's the essay that Steve Pinker wrote on edge.org now several years ago.
Right. I didn't get all the way through that, but so go ahead.
Well, he is saying that group selection is confusing both for cultural evolution and for genetic evolution. And he's also questioning the whole concept of cultural evolution. So he's actually, although, let me state, I respect these folks as long as they're sticking within their expertise. I have a lot of respect for all of them, actually, including Richard Dawkins. You have to take these things on a case-by-case basis, on a subject-by-subject basis. So I'm not disparaging any of these people in all respects, okay? So let's just get that clear.
Sure.
And so it's on the topic of group selection or on the topic of cultural evolution that we have to be thinking. And I would just encourage people to read lead essay plus the many commentaries by myself and others with this in mind and make your own decision. And what you'll find, I think, is that Pinker is an outlier. Forget about group selection on the subject of cultural evolution.
Yeah.
And including cultural group selection. Whereas most of the others that are working on this topic, Joe Henrich, Richardson, Boyd, Christopher Bohm, you could go on and on, are very comfortable, not, first of all, with the concept of cultural evolution as like genetic evolution, and secondly, that cultural group selection is a very strong force in human cultural evolution.
Sure, but I think historically Steve Pinker's position, and here he disagrees with Dawkins. He thinks Dawkins makes too much out of the parallels between cultural and genetic evolution. I think his position has been, although he didn't read that particular paper, that it's kind of what I said. Cultural evolution is, although again, I actually think there are interesting parallels more than he does, but he would emphasize the messiness of cultural evolution where the parallels break down. So he thinks as an analytical matter, I think, you're not going to be able to use the same tools you use with some precision, the same analytical tools to talk about genetic evolution, to talk about cultural evolution. Now, that said, I think, again, if you ask him, well, why has this process, how has this process you described in your last book happened, whereby people get gentler and gentler? I think he'd say, yeah, you can call it cultural evolution so long as you don't pretend that it's very analogous to genetic evolution. In other words, he's not disagree. You know, he's again within the realm of. I mean, at that level, you agree. If you say that's because of cultural evolution, he'd say, well, it's sure not because of genetic evolution. It's not that the gene pool has been changing that fast. Yeah, so call it culture. He'd agree there. Right.
Sure, and then you get to another set of issues, and very interesting, very much in play. So among other things, I just hope that a lot more people will pay attention to it. And as to the question of whether the cultural units are more coherent than the genetic units, and so on and so forth, I would just direct readers to the work, for example, of Peter Turchin, in which or any historian, this is where you get kind of curious, because just become a historian, and what will you see? You will see social units that are very, very salient as social units. Give me a break. The competitive advantage of nations compared to other nations based on their internal social organization.
Sure.
We really need to question whether there's a coherent social.
Look, I wrote a book about this. I mean, that I spent a lot of time on this in Nonzero, and I say exactly that zero-sum or quasi-zero-sum competition between groups in cultural evolution favors the development of non-zero-sum reinforcing norms and laws and so on within groups.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I think you were, although you were kind of distanced yourself from the group selection controversy, you were very much talking about a process of between group selection
at the cultural level. Mm-hmm.
And of course, the genes can follow suit. Gene culture coevolution and rapid genetic evolution is part of the mix here. Mm-hmm. So I'd actually like to introduce another element. It'll only take a minute, but I think it's important, and it has to do with complexity. May I do that?
You may.
Okay.
You can spend a minute and 10 seconds. How about that?
Okay, I think I can actually do it in that time. So much of our intuition and the core models are based on a very simple mentality, genetic models, in which we assume that a behavior is coded by a gene. And we do this not because we think it's realistic, but because it's a way to simplify the math. But certain assumptions follow from that. For example, if you have groups that don't vary much genetically, then it must be the case that they don't vary much phenotypically, and so on and so forth.
Phenotype meaning the trait, the expression of the genes in observable traits. That's phenotypic.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that when you actually create groups in the laboratory, even when you create them with, initiate them with many individuals, and often it can be ecosystems, not groups, what you find is that they vary a lot, much more than you would ever imagine, based on this simple kind of additive thinking. Now, why is that? Most of us know about the butterfly effect, the idea that in a complex system, a tiny initial difference doesn't stay small. It actually becomes the seed for larger differences. And so with the weather, for example, or with a complex system like that, if you change an initial condition, then that becomes the seed for larger changes. Now, against that background, imagine setting up a bunch of groups or ecosystems or communities with large numbers of individuals. So they're almost identical, but not quite, okay? Now, they're complex systems. All those interactions are taking place. What's going to happen to the differences among those groups? Are they going to stay small, which is how they started out based on sampling error, or are they going to become different based on their initial difference? And so the same thing that gives you the butterfly effect also gives you variation among units, when those units are large social groups and even multi-species ecosystems. And this is like a real game changer. Not many people appreciate the importance of this, because what's needed for higher level selection, group selection, of course, is variation among groups, and it has to be heritable. But with complex systems, this variation is much more plentiful than you would expect based on the core models that's accountable for all of our intuition. So it's for this reason that such things as nations can differ from each other, even though they're huge. Cultural groups can differ from each other, even though there's massive migration between groups. Mm-hmm. Our microbiomes can be different from each other, even though the microbiomes in each of us is composed of many trillions of individuals and tens and thousands of species. We can still differ in our microbiomes. It's a whole new ballgame when it comes to higher level selection, and very difficult to formulate in terms of either selfish gene theory or inclusive fitness theory, which actually requires sort of taking the view of a lower level unit, which is very difficult when the lower level unit is part of a very, very complex system.
Okay, I'd say in cultural evolution, one reason it can work so fast is also a reason that some people might resist analogizing it too closely with genetic evolution, is that whole cultural systems can hop from nation to nation, more readily than genes can jump from person to person. So it can happen really fast.
Yeah, but again, just go back to bacteria, all the gene swapping that takes place with bacteria, mm-hmm. and you'll see that that's
at that level.
At that level, and that's genetic evolution.
Yeah.
So the idea that genetic evolution is not necessarily vertical, that there can be large elements of horizontal transmission in genetic evolution. You're right, the degree of vertical versus horizontal transition is a big parameter, but it's a parameter that we have to consider for both genetic and cultural evolution.
Right. Although in the case of humans, unless there's something I'm missing, it's pretty much vertical, right? My genes are not jumping to anyone without my having sex.
With human genetic evolution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we're at 58 minutes, and probably an hour would be as fascinating as this has been for you and me. There may be
trying the patience of our
maybe people whose patience is in the process of being tested. But if there's anything else, I can't think of any other questions I have. But if there's anything else you want to say in closing, why don't you go ahead?
Well, I think the simple logic of multi-level selection is really essential for thinking about human society, including topics such as economics and other public policy topics, because it so much is the case that we exist in a nested hierarchy of groups. And the idea that what's good for me is not necessarily good for my family, what's good for my family is not necessarily good for my clan, all the way up to what's good for my nation is not necessarily good for the global economy, or it is actually a very different paradigm than what we typically take as the paradigm of economics, which is the idea that self-interest, the pursuit of self-interest, robustly benefits the common good. Just let the lower level units do what they want to do, and then that's going to lead to a well-working society, is exactly what's not the case as far as multi-level selection is concerned. It turns out that multi-level selection does result in a legitimate concept of the invisible hand, but one which would require another hour to talk about.
Right. And I did, in terms of cultural evolution, human history, I did argue in Nonzero that more and more enlightened self-interest involves recognizing the correlation between your fortunes and the fortunes of people all over the world. And in that sense, things have gotten more non-zero sum.
No, I think that you nailed a lot of good points in non-zero. I'm not arguing. You're not my quarry here, Bob. Other people are.
Okay, good. So I'm safe for the time being. Thank you so much. This has been, I hope, valuable. This is an issue that's really important, both academically and in terms of the enduring question of like what people are like and what are the prospects for the future. So David Sloan Wilson, author of Does Altruism Exist? Also president of the Evolution Institute, which people can Google. Thanks a lot, and let's continue the conversation down the road.
Okay, that was fun. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.